Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Remy Bertot, co-organizer with Emilie Aumier of the Open Source Founders Summit. It's an event that takes place in Paris every year, mid-May. The summit is an event for founders and leaders of open source businesses. Today, the conversation we are having with Avi Press and Boris Baldassari is kind of an example of conversation that you can have during the summit. So today we will talk about metrics and metrics in open source projects. But first, I'm going to ask Avi and Boris to present themselves a little bit so that you know who they are.
Sure. My name's Avi Press. I'm the founder and CEO of Scarf, based here in Oakland, California. And for the last 7 years, I've been very focused on open source usage analytics. And so this topic could not be more relevant for me.
And my name is Boris Baldassari. I work for the Eclipse Foundation. I'm part of the EMO team, Eclipse Management Office, where we make sure that Eclipse projects succeed. So we talk a lot about onboarding, trainings, governance, IP, and so on.
So let's dive in the metrics. Uh, Metrics are used by open source projects and businesses to measure a lot of things. So let's touch on the difference between metrics and for businesses and projects first. So do you see, Avi, some conflicts between like metrics for businesses and project, and do you feel that what makes a project healthy is not necessarily what makes a business successful? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're definitely not like directly in conflict with one another, but oftentimes things that are good for one and what are good for the other are just not the same. So I think not necessarily so much conflict, but can be different at various times. So, um, like in a purely non-commercial project, I think there's a lot of focus on metrics like, okay, how diverse is the contributor base, right? Like how many different organizations or people are contributing, the bus factor, these kinds of things are a very common focus for non-commercial projects. And for commercial projects, those things don't matter nearly as much, right? You can definitely have a wildly successful single vendor open source project that is very good as a business. And so I think these things are often quite different, but where they do overlap, I think, is in the usage, right? Like, if there's a lot of usage and adoption in the project, I think both of these camps are very happy. And so I think we tend to focus a lot on things like, how many users does the project actually have, right? That's, I think, a very important one. How fast is that growing? If you cut a new release for the project, how much of the user base adopts that new version, and how quickly do they adopt it, and these kinds of things. And so, there's you can go so deep on these on this side of these usage metrics, and I think there's a lot that both the commercial and non-commercial camps will care very deeply about. But yeah, I think the businesses will definitely have a more of a slant on things like, how many companies are adopting and what kinds of companies, how big are they, that kind of thing will matter a lot more to the business. And so we can get into all the details there, and I'm excited for that.
And you, Boris, what do you think make specifically like a project healthy? What kind of metrics do you guys are looking at the foundation?
In the beginning of the project, I would say that activity is the main metrics to watch. So that would be probably number of commits, which is a very basic metric. But in the beginning, if there are regular commits, that's a good thing. Also, the diversity, so the number of contributors. You probably want to make sure that there is at least some adoption, community building as soon as the beginning. It's always best. I will look into the number of issues open, or the time to close issues, so which really show the activity and the reactivity of the project. I think in the beginning, these are the one that make the more sense, just to get the project off the ground, basically.
Okay. And from your perspective, like Avi, let's talk about like, have you seen like projects that were like successful, healthy projects, but that fail as a business? And what kind of like metrics would you look at it like for this kind of
I'd say it's the default, right? Most successful projects do not necessarily make good businesses, right? And I think most open source foundations, I think, is a good example of this, right? Like, how, you have a lot of successful projects. How many public companies are behind these projects, or how many of these projects turn into public companies? Very few, almost none. And I think that would be, one of the main, like, I don't know, maybe a top line, really, really high level metric to look at to show this. And, if you look at most ecosystems, the number is probably 1 or 0. And so I think by default, this is very, very common. And so I think what ends up being a lot more of the, thing to really look at is what are the exceptions to this and what makes those unique and what can we learn from those. But yeah, I think we see this all the time of just tons and tons of, very, very useful projects. You may even have a lot of enterprise adoption, but that just does not mean that you have a healthy business underneath it. And, I think depending on what kind of technology we're talking about, what kind of ecosystem you fit in, those things look very different, right? Like what does the commercially successful library look like versus the commercially successful database versus, application level, all do end up looking quite different a lot of the time.
But do you think, Boris, that there is some metrics that are missing, like to connect both worlds, the business and the project, high-performing, usage-driven project that don't have business legs to run with?
I guess that really depends on the context. So at the Eclipse Foundation, our core values are openness, transparency, meritocracy, and vendor neutrality. Because so we have business friendly, so which means that actually people come to us because they want kind of a guardians of the commons. And in that context, vendor neutrality, bus factor, a number of different organizations contributing or different individuals contributing is key for the sustainability of the project, and the fact that many different competitors outside of the foundation can actually contribute together, collaborate on these projects. So in our context, the metrics I would tend to look at are really, number of contributors and contributions coming from different individuals and different organizations. That said, still in the context of the Eclipse Foundation, we also have a lot of oversight of the project. So the projects are quite free. They can do almost whatever they want, as long as it's within the open source rules, kind of. And so we do project reviews from time to time. We check the intellectual property, the license compatibility, stuff like that. So one of the criteria I use to know if a project is healthy after some time is, did they engage recently with us? Are they checking if the IP is always clean? Do they have regular releases? These are the things we could look at in the context of the Eclipse Foundation.
But you don't check if these businesses that are part of a project are doing well, or like you don't go at checking how they are doing as a business, right?
No, because we are the guardians of this common part that is
Yes.
developed by these different organizations. It's absolutely fair that they can build whatever they want on top of that. So the thing is collaborating on the plumbery and competing on the porcelain. That's kind of the sentence we use. So they can do whatever they want outside of the foundation, as long as they stay within the rules as for the common block.
So let's talk a little bit about like the difference between like early project and like more established project, and the same for businesses like startups and more established businesses. Like Avi, from your experience, like what kind of metrics should people focus in the early stage?
I think there's a lot of different things, but what's coming into mind at first. One thing that we see for projects, like if you look at, for instance, AI projects versus non-AI projects, I think illustrate this very well. Where what we see for if you take every database project that we track, for instance, if you compare these things side by side, what we tend to see is that the AI projects have significantly steeper growth rates, both in terms of how organizations are adopting it, how many people at those organizations, that kind of thing. And I think early stage startups will tend to care a lot about those growth rates over all else. I think as the project starts to mature, you start caring about churn a lot more, right? So given that someone downloaded this project 60 days ago, what's the likelihood we're going to see them this month? Like that becomes a very important thing to predict. And for many businesses, like if you are caring about your ARR and your NRR, these kinds of things, you want to really make sure that when you acquire a user, you're going to keep them. And so I think as the business matures, you're going to care more about retention, and not that you don't care about growth, but you may need to really kind of juggle the retention a lot more than if you're just like trying to gain market share as quickly as possible and it's growth, right? And so one of the frameworks that we use for tracking this stuff is the notion of the adoption funnel. So, who's at the top of the funnel and like the intro, like who's learning about the project for the first time, right? And given that a user or an organization is reading about the project, what is the likelihood that they go and download an artifact from the project? Given that they've downloaded an artifact from the project, what's the likelihood that they're going to download the next version once that's released? And so I think a lot of businesses will start to really zero in on what that adoption funnel looks like for their project and start to optimize those conversion rates at each stage of that funnel. And so I think this is where in this framework, you start to see that the maturity of the business, it starts to kind of matter what parts of the funnel they're really optimizing for the most. And I think that's a framework that gives a pretty strong differentiator where you can start to really evaluate the business maturity based on what these conversion rates are, based on what these growth rates look like, and just how big that audience is, right? Of course, I think when you have these really small numbers for a startup, like all the, all your metrics and your targets and benchmarks will look very different. And then these things start to stabilize as the project and company matures.
So, follow-up question for you, Boris. Like, do you think like people tend to focus on the wrong metrics too early? Like, for example, try to optimize for governance metrics, even though there are like very few contributors, or like, do you see like some mistakes there? Like, I'm trying to pick up some metrics that are gold standard for some larger projects, but that don't really apply to small projects.
I think that optimizing one metric is a mistake. And as soon as you do that, it's not a good measure anymore. So the thing is, I think there is a lot of education to do about what do metrics actually mean. And so there are some common things like number of commits, generally speaking, shows activity within the project. That does not mean that you can use to compare projects, because different teams will have different ways of committing, merging, squashing commits, and so on. So you cannot use that for as a comparison. But generally speaking, commits shows the activity. Then that extends to everything, and we have a number of people asking for the number of lines of code. I mean, whatever the metric, if you start focusing on one metric and trying to optimize that, you miss everything else. And the mistake is not in choosing the metrics; it's in trying to optimize one metric without seeing the whole context. And for the record, so the lines of code metric over the last 40, 50 years has been the metric that is correlated to everything almost. It's the main metric. You still cannot use that to measure the efficiency of a developer or whatever. If one developer reduces the number of lines of code and just makes it more efficient and so on, I mean, don't measure efficiency or productivity.
And I wanted to touch a little bit on monitoring and privacy because, like, Scarf, you touch on at Scarf, you are basically like proposing services to like see where people are in the funnel and like if people come back and like so obviously these have privacy implications. So can you tell us like what's your approach on that and how to make sure that you don't create conflict there?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the key things that made our approach very different and why we were able to really grow at all, right? I think when we got started, any single project that we worked with, it was something that the maintainers were very worried about doing. They really wanted to do it, but they were very worried about what their communities would say, and it was, a huge thing each time because it was so against the grain historically, right? This was back in like 2019 and 2020 when we were just getting started. What made us different and what made the approach different is a couple things. So one is that we had an invariant in our system that we would not have, that no PII would be durably stored. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, for any given download that we may track, or any, page view of the docs or any event that we are tracking, we are not going to store the IP address or anything that would identify that user, right? And that was a very important thing. It makes the approach GDPR compliant. Asterisk, there's more things to it than just that, but that's one. I think that's one of the main things that contributes to that. And from there, it's this idea that you are working on statistics and not identifying information, right? And even protecting the data from us seeing it, right? So like if Scarf is hacked, like, okay, nothing got leaked because we don't have anything to leak, and that's the really important. That's the really important component of this that really made Scarf able to grow at all, I think, from a place where this was a very controversial thing to do. The other thing that I think was a really, really important, not like a technical breakthrough so much as just an understanding of the communities that we work with. Really early on, the first thing that got a lot of traction of ours was an NPM package. And the way that it worked is you just add this package as a dependency in your JavaScript project. And then when NPM install gets run on your package, Scarf would get installed and send a post install hook, right? Very, very simple. Just like, here's the version of the package that got installed. That's it. We're done. Here's what got sent. We would show that to the user. So it's very transparent and you could opt out, all these things. But people still really didn't like it once it got really popular. And we learned, I literally got on the phone with people who were really vocally against what we were doing. And what came up was, NPM was already collecting this exact same metrics. We were just sharing it with maintainers. So like the question was, what's the difference here? Why are you okay with NPM collecting this data and not sharing it with the maintainers? But when Scarf does it, we don't like it. What's the difference? And what we learned was, what people told us was, well, when I type npm install, I didn't expect it was going to send data outside of the firewall. I would phone home to a third party that I didn't, know about or expect in advance. Fair point, right? And so what did we do? We tried to make ways of collecting data that did not require that fit more into people's expectations and also did not phone home in an unexpected time. And so
Especially with malware these days. I can
right,
understand,
exactly.
like, being
It's a moving
developer
target,
myself,
right?
I would not like that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And many people agree. And so
Yeah.
what we ended up doing was having things that fit more into people's expectations and also did not have to phone home. And so some of our tools, so we have Scarf Gateway, which is a way to basically, if someone downloads your package on a registry, they just have to make a HTTP request on the internet. There's no way around this, and people
Yeah,
know
of
this and
course.
people
Yeah.
understand this. Okay, great. Well, now the gateway is a middle layer in front of that download. So think like a Docker pull that hits a service first. Okay, now that service has the data, and you didn't have to make an extra HTTP request. Everybody's happy. Okay, a cookieless tracking pixel that's in the docs. Everyone expects this, right? You load a web page, there's going to be some analytics. Now you go to the docs of a site of a project. Okay, now there's some analytics for the project that page in the docs got read. So there's these very natural like compromises between what Google Analytics are these very invasive analytics approaches versus what the open source community needs as a bare minimum. And by giving those tools out and making sure that even Scarf would not be able to misuse the data, was basically enough, I think. And so I think what we've learned here is the right way to do analytics in open source, where we're not compromising privacy, but we're still being able to provide useful things to maintainers and foundations and the community generally. And I think that's what has led to a pretty good compromise.
These metrics in terms of security are super useful now these days. Like you would want to know, like, did people download that version that was compromised, or like, so
Yes,
it even have
exactly.
like some other usage than just like, okay, is it useful or not? It's like it can be interesting in terms of security. And you,
Yeah.
Boris, sorry,
Oh,
I
sorry.
wanted
Can I
to
say
ask
one more thing
Boris.
about it really
Yes, go
quick?
ahead. Yes, yes, of course.
That would be one other, I think, really, really good metric for more mature companies to understand is, if there is a vulnerability announced in one of our releases, how long does it take for us to get everybody off of that release and onto something new? Very, very underrated metric, I think.
Okay, Boris, and from a foundation perspective, how do you think about monitoring project health and like metrics that maintainer needs, and what are the red lines for you at the foundation?
So, very interesting question because there have always been between a tension between have a great open source project. We have a few contributions. We have no idea how many users we have. So it's always been something that could be interesting, but we never provided because we historically always pushed back on calling home even for updates. So any type of data collection was basically forbidden for all Eclipse projects. That said, I'm in charge of the metrics program at the Eclipse Foundation, and we collect activity metrics, so issues, MRs, PRs, mailing lists, stuff like that. Basically, every information we gather is public information, so we just gather it, present it in a nice dashboard. So we use Grimoire Lab for the records for that. And so the public interface for this dashboard, we anonymize every PII, personally identified information, and we provide only so everything else basically, including the organization names. So we are very, very cautious about not displaying any PII, even if it's public information. But nowadays, with the CRA and the increasing level of downloads and so on, sometimes that may be required. So the CRA explicitly says that you need to check for updates. So some projects might need to implement that. Also, we have projects which have a huge success, like OpenVSX, millions of downloads per day. So that's huge. And at some point, you kind of need to keep track of that. So definitely we won't collect any personal data. But we might need at some point to let individual projects, because project actually shows what they do within some limits. we will probably we are discussing about letting projects implement some tracking without any personal data collection. So things are moving, things are evolving with new regulations and new constraints. And at some point, especially when you have millions of downloads a day, at some point you need to track that because it has a cost, infrastructure cost, and so on. And so we need to know what's going on in order to provide a sustainable services for that. So things are moving, and there are a lot of discussions happening around these topics.
Cool. And what about you, Avi? Do you think you have an opinion on like what we could do to have like better shared standards for open source metrics?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, I don't think there's really good, consensus or agreement on the framework of like what these things even are. And so, like, we work with a bunch of different foundations where the foundations will, they approve of, they kind of formally validate that SCARF is approved in the foundation, and they, set up some agreement with us where we work with their projects, that kind of thing. But even then, the foundations don't typically give the projects much of a, much guidance on how to think about what they should be tracking, right? And I think some of them start to with things like, and I don't know if Eclipse has a similar version of this, but like, the Linux Foundation, there are graduation milestones and requirements. And, are those metrics? Sometimes they are data driven, sometimes they're not. And they're just more of like, is this box checked? And I think there's a bit of both of those things. But, one thing that we have seen is that when those projects are able to say, well, here's all of the, Fortune 500s that rely on, this project, and here's how they have stayed as users over time. These are metrics that I think everyone, I think everyone feels that they are evidence that the project is useful when they are shown them, but don't necessarily think about it in a way of like, this is something that you need to track up front. But I think that the foundations could be more prescriptive about what they think projects really need to be tracking when it comes to usage and adoption generally. I think that I would love to see foundations in general be a bit more thoughtful about the business side of these projects as well, because I think, what we see a lot is like foundations can definitely set projects up for success and give them, a lot of the things that they need. But if there are not healthy ecosystems commercially around the project, well, then someone has to, someone is paying for the maintainer's livelihood somewhere, right? And I think that, for a long time, that's just been out of the scope of what the foundations, do or are concerned with. And I think that's fine in a lot of places. But I think there are some foundations where there's so much investment into these ecosystems that it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable unless you have some kind of way to keep that going, right? And I think sometimes there's, venture capital interest, and that gives it, a really big push, but it doesn't keep it going beyond once those businesses are not putting up the numbers that the VCs want to see, right? And so, again, I think the cloud native space is a really great example of this, where there's a lot of the interest, but then how many IPOs are there? How long is that going to keep up for? And so I would definitely like to see the business side of these things be more of a primitively cared about suite of metrics for foundations. But I think that won't be appropriate for all of them, of course, but I think I would like to see more.
What's your thoughts, Boris, on open source metrics and shared standards? Like, is it like the direction you want the tool you're building to take, or do you have some other goals in mind for your project?
So we are prescriptive regarding what Eclipse project should be doing or not on topics like this. So on topics which have an impact on data collection, privacy, governance, we watch. We watch, and so usually it's more about answering questions and helping projects do the right thing. So we are we have a lot of guidelines regarding data collection, governance at the project level, also another topic, but AI. So generally speaking, we are prescriptive. So projects have quite some autonomy as long as they stay within some limits that make so people come to the foundation, organizations come to the Eclipse Foundation because they know they can find software they can trust here. And trust, it's about so data collection, it's about integrity, it's about vendor neutrality, making sure that there won't be a change in license in a couple of years, stuff like that. And we just check that projects do the right things when it comes to decisions that may impact their users. So yeah, we have a lot of guidelines, but then that's not necessarily something that you can see in metrics, I would say. So it's more about having a human relationship with the maintainers, with the users, listening to what people have to say about this type of behavior and so on, then discussing with the maintainers and making sure that everybody is aligned, because actually, if everybody is happy, it's best for all of us, including for the sustainability of the project and the end users. So that's where we are.
Thank you both. I think this was really interesting. We are running out of time, so I hope if you viewed this episode, you enjoyed the kind of conversation that you could experience at the Open Source Founder Summit. So hopefully we'll see you there and continue the conversation there. Thank you for everyone for joining us today and for listening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.